I'm not surprised. And it's really a great pleasure to welcome everyone to this session, which is really inaugurating a series of seminars which have been put together to celebrate Ewan Campbell's 70th birthday. And this is a great privilege for us. We value him as a colleague, as a friend, and it just seemed a good reason to invite some interesting people to come and talk to us about topics which we know are dear to Ewan, and to really, we think by kind of making it alive, just demonstrate how central he is and has been to the development of our field in the last 20, 30 years. This is series, as you can guess from the backdrop behind me, is being hosted jointly by the Archaeology Department, as we don't say anymore, and the Centre for Scottish and Celtic Studies. And so the seminars will appear during the course of this coming year. Now, so this is just one of a number. We're recording this, okay? So if you'd prefer not to have your face, on YouTube forever, then you can turn it off. And I hope everyone has turned off their microphones. We've got so many people involved now. So yeah, turn on. We're over 100 people, so we definitely want to kind of keep that that background feedback in check. So I'm going to begin the process by in a second by sharing my screen and showing you a few slides, which will help, I think, to put this this whole thing in a bit of context, and then after I've been at it for a wee while, Adrián will take over, and then we'll hear from Ewan himself, and then there's going to be an opportunity to have some conversation with Ewan. So hopefully these little presentations will stimulate you to maybe think up questions, comments, and if you please use the chat function to record any questions, and Ewan and Adrián and I will try to referee that and manage that discussion. We're going to save this stuff. As I say, the film will be up on YouTube. I'm not quite sure where we'll put the chat, but I guess, well, if it's interesting, we'll save it and put it somewhere. Okay, so now I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully we're now in business, almost in business. Okay, well, I really want to emphasize that this is not a retirement. Apart from anything else, Ewan hasn't really retired. And if anything, his appetite for archaeology seems even bigger and more involved than it has ever been. But nevertheless, whenever you think back on these things, there is a kind of bittersweet sense in which, there's a lot of, we've experienced so many of these positive contributions, and they are in the past. Now, obviously, we're looking forward as well, but we really want to have that reflective thing. We want to situate Ewan's work, and we hopefully will bring out some of the, if you like, the social and intellectual context within which he's working. And also, I think we'll probably pick up some lessons in a life well lived as we go on. Anyway, we'll begin just with a few comments about where Ewan's from, where he's going. I'm hoping he's going to fill in some of this detail. I mean, some of this predates me. A lot of it predates me. he studied at Glasgow University. He studied geology. He went away and he came back. And so much of his early life, I don't want to say it's shrouded in mystery, but we didn't experience it. He graduated from the university in the early 70s, and he went straight into working in the field as a commercial archaeologist. And already he's kind of developed a kind of, well, you can pick up this idea of, there's a bit of antipathy. If we're trying to understand why Ewan left Glasgow, it's perhaps this, that hard man world of 1971 is kind of, that antipathy is reflected in the comments here. And so this is what he's doing. Now, then there's as I say, there's quite a missing years, because the period of his PhD is in the 80s, and we'll talk about that. Starts in mid 80s, and through this, he has just established himself as one of the most important and influential contributors to discourse about the archaeology of early medieval Scotland and Britain and Ireland. So it's this kind of very strong Irish Sea command he has. And there's a thing which I think we particularly want to emphasize is there, and I think maybe this, he can comment on this if he likes, there's a kind of radical political background to Ewan's upbringing, which maybe makes him more iconoclastic, maybe makes him more interested in courting controversy. And certainly where the Scots-Irish has created, a certain amount of heat and in a very good way. He has contributed to a whole series of monographs, often providing if they're not his own monographs, providing a kind of spine of the discussion, which is so closely rooted in the material. And there's a kind of stealthiness to it, in the sense that he's always doing stuff, and he's always, doing a specialist report for here or there. So as a consequence, over these decades, he has built up this amazing portfolio, which has allowed him to effectively, I think, have had his hand on just about every important site that's been dug in northern Britain in about 30 years. We can think of a couple, where he's not been involved with, but the coverage which he has had has been amazing, and you can just summarize it in this sort of way, and this kind of characteristic view of close inspection of a ring-headed pin or whatever. I thought we'd have more photographs of that like that, but it is certainly a kind of characteristic posture. One of the things which is great in terms of providing a bit of support and enthusiasm for us as colleagues is the enthusiasm that Ewan has it just in kind of talking about archaeology and showing people about archaeology, any chance really. And I think that's kind of that enthusiasm for the subject is behind his desire to participate in kind of any opportunity to dig that he can, and particularly if there's a kind of educational dimension to it. And we see we've seen this in kind of immense detail over a long period in our work with surf. And this you'll see there's kind of key members of the team, but it's actually a huge number of people. This I think Ewan must be taking the photograph because he's not actually in this one. But I just to make the point that it's a very big project and lots of people involved. And so having Ewan involved was a real boon for us. I mean, not only did he bring probably more field experience than most of us had, but he provided a kind of gentle guidance and advising leadership, which allowed him to make a huge contribution to all the different sites that were being excavated, whether they were the early medieval ones or the Neolithic or whatever. And, he's at the heart of, he's always seemed to be at the middle of everything, all the fun, all the kind of interesting stuff that was going on. Ewan would be around. And kind of giving this, kind of sense of guidance and leadership, not only kind of working at a rate which most undergraduates can't begin to keep up with, but also kind of relishing kind of being out there in the kind of freezing cold and miserableness. One of the things which, I didn't really appreciate it till we started thinking about this, but Ewan didn't really get back into doing field work until about, well, this is the first time I remember working with him in Pollock Park in 2007. And I think, his family commitments didn't allow him to get out and do this sort of thing until about this time, once Rowan started getting old enough. So my experience of working with Ewan has really been framed by the surf project, and it's been really instructive. And what we ended up, what I realized now is that he was often kind of asked to deal with some of the more awkward, and on those rare occasions where we had find rich sites, he would be involved with it. So this is him trying to sort out the outwork for this brock that's being excavated and is producing all these goodies. And Ewan's ability to and knowledge about finds handling and analysis has been invaluable. And he's made sure that, well, that things get found, but he's made sure that the right people get to be shown them, and that right people includes all these school kids and stuff down here as well. And I suppose the other thing is we really valued his technical expertise, and we can see that in lots of ways. But the way which kind of struck me as being most revealing is this little bit of work which he did in 2013, which is trying to get at the kind of get a fixed point for the tower at Dunning to see whether we could get some kind of scientific date to identify when it's built. And so you'll see that the trench is tiny. So we have the schedule monument consent, a couple meters square. So it's about as small as we could manage. And of course, not surprisingly, there's burials almost immediately. These are very late children's burials, but nevertheless, procurator fiscal has to be called and the police come and yada, yada. The point is, you can see how tight and tiny and challenging it is to work in this space. And it soon became a one-person job. And Ewan just ended up having to kind of be very acrobatic to get at the archaeology and to do it. But I think there's very few people who would have been able to tease out this very subtle sequence of different construction phases, and also then to identify this early burial, which is conveniently running underneath our the earliest phase of the tower. So a great result for us to be able to get a scientific date for this. And I think this is really a testament to his kind of a demonstration of his technical ability. And I also just want to say that, as we've been going on with this, he's been a huge engine to make the post-excavation side of things carry on. So once the energy which is in the field is then immediately applied to resolving things back at the ranch. And I've no doubt that without his forceful encouragement, we wouldn't be looking at this new monograph about to come out any minute. So I'm going to stop now, and Adrián is going to pick up, well, I'll go at the milestones. Smiley milestones, okay. So take it away, Adrián.
Okay, so let's get to it, shall we? So this bit of the presentation, once I get it up, there you are. This bit of the presentation just kind of, this is for the undergrads in the audience, okay? Get your notebooks out. This is where we'll go through some of the highlights and some of what I personally think are some of the strands which run through Ewan's academic work. And then we'll end that bit, the really important work of establishing the CV, okay, the impact of Ewan's work. And then we'll end that bit with some really embarrassing photographs before we hand over to Ewan, okay? So here we are. The earliest publication that I was able to find, other than that Colchester Evening Gazette from 1972, is this one from the Scottish Archaeological Review, 1984, appropriately enough, on import wares, the kind of thing that he would carry on writing on for his PhD, and then publishing on and making a name for himself in the field internationally with this study of these exotic import wares. It was hugely important. Ewan can tell you later on, and we'll certainly ask him if he doesn't, why he got into this material in particular, but it hadn't really been studied. In fact, it had only been Raleigh Radford and then Charles Thomas who had highlighted these exotic kinds of ceramics coming from, it seems, very far afield from the Mediterranean and from France. And nobody had really sort of studied them together other than to highlight them, as Charles Thomas had done. It's with Ewan's work in particular that we begin to take this a little bit more seriously and scientifically, and then start to establish for Britain and Ireland where these things are coming from and where they're ending up. It was hugely important to open up these questions for the field. Moving forward into the 80s, in the sort of first few years of the PhD, is working closely with Alan Lane, and then for a few years after that, he's working as sort of an assistant lecturer for Alan Lane, working together on excavations, of course. And some of the big important early publications come from this partnership. I'd like to highlight as well this this article from 1987. This comes from work from excavated finds from Denad, in particular a quern marked with a simple cross. Now Ewan has this background in geology, and specifically the geology of Mull and Argyll, and this attention to the stone as well as the form of that cross were married together in this article. It's kind of marrying those two bits of training, formal training that he had in archaeology as well as in geology, which allowed him to trace the kinds of stones used on Denad and the kinds of stones used on Iona at the monastery of Iona, and link these two together. It was a really important milestone in our understanding of early medieval power, and how sometimes these Christian sites, these monastic centers, could also be power centers in their own right. And in fact, the power centers, like these hill forts, were certainly at a certain point heavily being propped up, legitimated by the church. It's that blurring of boundaries between what is a Christian place, what is a sacred place, and what is a secular place. That would go on to, it was part of the conversation in the 1980s, certainly. And it's sort of something that I think still needs to be said and restated over and over again. It also planted the seeds for Ewan's work on Iona, which would come a little bit later. But this is, in terms of the publication, rather than his own personal research in the 80s and those small publications in things like Scottish Archaeological Review and local journals in Wales, this is when it really goes big. In 1996, there were twin publications on these imports, where finally we are getting a much bigger audience for this work, the work that he had done on his PhD, really mapping out the distribution of these import wares and formalizing the language, the terminology that we continue to use for all these import wares today, your E wares and B wares. And it was these two articles in that year which really sort of put Ewan on the as a sort of leading voice on these things, if he hadn't been before. Another strand I want to highlight throughout his excavation work with Alan Lane on Danad, and as in the articles that I've already highlighted, he has obviously worked on the archaeology of Argyll in a big way, but it is this 3-year block, this sort of cluster of publications, which again formalizes what Ewan and I were talking, what Steve and I were talking about earlier, as the study of sort of deep Argyll. This is really getting to grips with the kingdom of the Scots, Dalriata, and what archaeological signature it might have. So, you know, Where the Scots Irish is this sort of genre-busting work where we are trying to get away from these ethnic modes of archaeology, which is very much the kind of it kind of tells you what was going on in the 1990s, where we had these big debates over, can we use the word Celts anymore? And, you know, is ethnicity a real thing, or is it a social construct? And can we see it in archaeology? And by focusing in on places of the Scots, royal places like Danad and these hill forts, he's able to zero in on one ethnic group, if you like, or one kingdom, and at the same time show that they are so intricately linked to all of these other groups, such that they are equal partners in this wider insular history. I think that's the really important takeaway here. When we break it down, as we did before, by coverage, these articles talking about the Scots, these articles talking about the Picts, when you actually read these articles, what you are seeing there is a focus on these areas, but a real success in expanding those out, placing these areas, these kingdoms, these ethnic groups, I suppose, into their wider context. So it isn't a sort of ethnic-led archaeology. And again, maybe we can talk about this more in the sort of Q&A about the, I don't know, the ideologies, the political sort of circumstances of the 1990s, devolution and things that were in the air at the time, and how they may or may not have influenced this work in particular. I think that's a really fascinating thing that we can maybe drill down into a little bit further. The study of Argyll, of course, is one of these long-term strands that really sort of carries through into his work still today. One of the most prominent sort of examples of this isn't a formal publication, but it should be. This is the research framework for early medieval Argyll that Ewan and Colleen Beatty did together. It's available for free online. There is so much knowledge here. It's the absolute critical reading list for the archaeology of the early medieval Western Scotland at the moment. So the work continues, is what I'm saying. Another long-term research strand. I'm not going to spend any more time on this because I've got another lecture later on in this series where Kate Forsyth and a few other friends will talk about Ewan's work on Iona. But this is just to reiterate again, these are these long-term research strands, subjects and areas that we are able to come back to in Ewan's work, and we can see how his views on the archaeology change over time. Kingship is another one of these things, and again, comparative kingship, focusing focusing not just on the Scots, but in real sort of heavy-hitting publications. Very few archaeologists can claim to have done this. Real statements of kingship in archaeology in Wales, in Western Scotland, in Pictland. You know, these are all sort of monumental publications in their own rights, you know. And again, these are things that Ewan didn't do on his own, but something that he certainly should be better known for. Okay. Archaeological science, I put that as an umbrella term. I think it's just sort of worth highlighting as well. These big ideas that we're talking about are rooted in the method. Now, Ewan doesn't actually have a lot of these articles which are about the method itself, but the empirical questioning comes through, the close look at the material culture, the fine-grained, thin section analysis of that pottery. That kind of meticulous scientific approach is something that he carries through in his work, but he also has had a real impact by teaching his students for the last, the last 20 years. This is something that really comes through, I think, if we sort of gathered it together, it comes through in the crop of students that have had Ewan as a supervisor. Another one that I want to highlight, and again, this is something that I think Ewan isn't as well known for. He has, in terms of the coverage, as we broke it down before, most of the articles are about west of Scotland and Dalriada, the Scots on either side of the North Channel, okay? But the second most was these synthetic works. These are the big groupings like his monograph in 2007 about the imports, but there are also articles which discuss multiple areas at once and to a certain extent the discipline itself. There's a lot more of these sort of reflections on archaeology hopefully still to come, but you can see it in the last few publications. Alice Blackwell's edited volume, Scotland in Early Medieval Europe, includes his keynote lecture talking about the study of early medieval Scotland as a discipline, as a genre, of archaeology. I think that's one of the most important publications in the last few years. And having seen it on academia, it's actually his second most viewed, even though it only came out, 2 years ago. The first viewed is, of course, Where the Scots Irish, the one that will be on his gravestone, but the second most viewed on academia.edu so far is his contribution for Alice Blackwell's edited volume, Scotland in Early Medieval Europe. So check it out. And don't miss this one from Antiquity as well. I don't think anything like this has ever been done. Sort of a conversation about sort of archaeology and psychology, psychotherapy. So if you haven't read that one, that's a good read as well. Okay, put your notebooks down. We've got through that bit. We won't be quizzing you later, but we might quiz you in on some things, or he can school us on all the things that we've got wrong. But first, just a couple of images. So far, we've had some contributions from close friends and colleagues, but we encourage you to keep sending these in. If you have photos of Ewan with long hair in the 1970s, I need to see them, okay? We need to see more of those. So Ewan, please switch on your microphone. Steve, feel free to switch on your microphone. Let's go through some of these, okay? These are just nice ones. This one I got from Ewan. He offered this one up himself. If you can't see it because there's little video recording faces of speakers, you can always minimize that on your screen. You can hide the thumbnail videos. You can see these photographs. That's Ewan in 1970. You might recognize that same bandana from his picture in 1972. I guess it was his thing back in those days.
Yes, it was the same one.
It's quite practical, I guess, to hold back the hair, but wow. More recently, this is on our way to survey on Iona before any of the more recent excavations. Okay, this is us being very excited to embark on a new bit of field work on Iona, which continues hopefully to this day and into next year. A beautiful one from Heather here. Don't try this at home. Ewan, as we haven't heard yet, Ewan is a very experienced mountain climber. He's like a mountain goat, and you can see him trying out some yoga moves there on a. By the way, I should say this was on a student field trip. This was on a surf field trip, so setting a certain kind of example there, Dr. Campbell. Again, I dithered over whether to show this one, but you know what? It's on Facebook. It's public record now. The saddle shape on that particular hog back at Govan was not caused by Ewan sitting on it, but he's demonstrating one of the ways in which it could have been created, I'm sure, for the purposes of science. Just another classic pose, just one for the ages. Ewan and me in one of the trenches there in 2017. I should say, by the way, that this was excavated not by me, even though I'm wearing the hard hat there. I'm just basking in the glory. This was excavated mostly by Joss Stern and Jamie Barnes, Kathy McKeever, Heather Christie, several other people I'm sure I've missed. Another great one from that season, Time Out on Iona. Why wouldn't you do fieldwork on Iona if you had the chance? This is doing some Tai Chi on the beach with Aura there. And just one nice one to finish off on. Beautiful contribution from Daniel McLean. Heads up to Daniel if you're in the audience. Thank you for these photographs. Please do keep sending these photographs in. If you want to record a little piece, a little story of yourself, sort of reminiscing, telling the story about you, and please do send those in to me or Steve. All right, so that's all for now. Make sure you keep on sending these in. I'm going to log off now, and we're going to hand over to the man of the hour himself. All right, so Ewan, please, how did we get it wrong?
Before anything else, I just want to say thank you to everybody for organising this and for turning up. It's really quite overwhelming. I know it's a very busy time for everybody, and just amazing that people have taken this time. And thank you all to people who are going to contribute to the seminars as well. That would be wonderful. Yeah, lost the place there. And also thanks for organising this completely new form of fish reef, the Zoom fish reef, I think you can call it. Maybe you've started something new, maybe this will take place a lot more. There's lots of things I could say about the presentation. You brought up some very old papers which are quite wrong. So it's good to admit that very first one about Ewer, we're pretty sure now it does come from the Aquitaine. The geology was fine, the interpretation was a bit off. But that's not surprising. I mean, things do change. I didn't know quite what to do here in the talk. I thought you might be interested in why I got involved in archaeology in the first place. So I'll tell you a bit about that and the missing years you were talking about earlier. I'd been interested in archaeology, read about Egypt and so on when I was a young teenager and things a lot. But then when I left school, and I left at 16, which was quite common in those days in Scotland, to go to university, I think it was my mother actually arranged for me to go on a dig with Ewan Mackay, digging an Iron Age site up in the extreme northwest in Loch Broom near Ullapool. And that was my first experience of archaeology, and it really, I think, set the scene for my interest in archaeology. And it helped also that the sun shone for 4 weeks, day after day, which doesn't always happen in Western Scotland. And so after that, while I was at university, I did various digs with Ewan Mackay and with Jack Scott around Glasgow and prehistoric sites. So I had a bit of a background in what actually was a pretty old-fashioned type of archaeology. And then I did my degree in geology, which turned out to be extremely useful because there's a lot of crossovers between geology and archaeology, of course. The principles of stratigraphy are just the same. There's a lot of taxonomic and taphonomic ideas which have come from geology into archaeology, and just the ability to identify natural materials and natural landforms and distinguish them from man-made materials and man-made landforms has been really useful throughout my career. But when I finished my degree, I didn't want to work in the oil industry or mining industry, and I think you can see from my dress I probably wouldn't have fitted into the corporate environment very much. So I decided to go on the hippie trail to India, but not being very good at that. I only got as far as Colchester, and that's where I I ended up working on the digs there. And it was my first experience of big urban excavations and first experience of Harris matrix and single context recording, and finding out the necessity of that in these deeply stratified sites. And from that period onward, I worked over most of the 70s in various digs in various places. I also had a period in Glasgow museums and art galleries as well, employed there. But that's when I got most of my knowledge of how to work on excavations. And I also met some famous people. Mortimer Wheeler came to Colchester. There's a picture of him I've got somewhere appearing. So it's nice to have contact with that. One of the great old figures of archaeology. He was actually born in Glasgow, surprisingly, though he always presented himself as a quintessential sort of Englishman. And then after that time, my girlfriend went to Cardiff to study archaeology, and I met Alan Lane, and he persuaded me to go back to university and do a PhD in archaeology, looking at the imports, and that's where I started doing that sort of work. And my career since then has been a series of, if you like, accidents. It's not really been very directed, and I thought you might be interested in, Adrián's talked about some of the papers I did, where the actual impetus for some of them came from. I mean, obviously the work on the imports and pottery and glass all came from that initial work, particularly on the site of Dinas Powys that Leslie Alcock had excavated. And so that obviously explains the corpus of imported pottery and glass and so on, my work on that. But the Scots-Irish paper, that arose initially, it was actually pre-devolution and the debate in that. It was when we were starting to write up the Donad volume and looking at the background to the Scottish, the origins of the Scots, for example. And that crystallized actually when I came to Glasgow and started teaching this quite radical course with Dobbit Brun in Scottish in history, and Thomas Clancy in Celtic, where we did this joint course on early medieval Gaeldom. And it was talking to them that really crystallized these ideas about Scots and Irish. And that paper arose out of that. And it was quite a difficult thing to do because it involved language and history as well as archaeology, and not being a specialist in those fields, saying something radical was quite difficult. But I always I'd encourage anybody who's worried about that just to talk to the people involved in the other subjects, and you'll get a good understanding of these different areas of endeavour, really. The Digging Deeper paper, that arose out of the TAG, one of the TAG conferences that came to Glasgow, and I was sitting talking to my friend Rob Leeper, one of my oldest friends from university, who's a psychologist, and we just decided we'd do something completely off the wall. I'd talk about psychology and he'd talk about archaeology, and we'd present this at this conference. I think there was some alcohol involved at the time, probably. And that's where it came from, but it's something that's always been an interest of mine, and it was just good to develop it. Martin Carver agreed to publish it in Antiquity in the last issue that he was editing. He said because it was so strange. A lot of the other things that I've worked on really have been a result of writing up other people's excavations. It seems to have been a theme maybe of some of the work I'd done. Started off with Dinas Powys and reinterpreting Leslie Alcock's excavations there, and then being employed to write up Richard Atkinson's work on the prehistoric site at Solace and the Outer Hebrides. And each of these, and then again writing up Jack Scott's work on Loch and Crannog, and more recently Charles Thomas's work on excavations at Iona. So I seem to have been doing this an awful lot. And it's been very interesting. I could say more about it maybe. I don't want to go on and on about this. It's made me understand all these people were working from a sort of culture history background and reinterpreting their investigation, their excavations, and understanding how they recorded them and how to interpret that recording has been really sort of central to some of the work I've done. And I talked a bit about Harris Matrix and single context recording, which we're all familiar with. There are, of course, problems with that as well, and anybody who's tried to interpret students' context sheets will know that description is not the same as understanding. Maybe I should stop there and let you ask some questions. Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, one thing I want to add as well is that sometimes the specialist report goes even further, I think, than some of the conclusions in the monograph itself. I'm thinking of your contribution to Whithorn as well, where you kind of effectively disagree with the very early monastic interpretation based on the quality and the kinds of finds that you were finding there, and that's in the publication, you know, and Peter Hill's, the late Peter Hill's final interpretation kind of goes off in another direction, but it's all in there, you know. How did you find working with that assemblage? Because that was all very difficult to handle as well. So you were kind of not writing somebody else's work, but you're interpreting very difficult sort of community-led excavation context sheets and things like these.
Well, there weren't any context really. Like there are no sections from Whithorn, you know, that it was difficult, and I had to just do it on the basis of horizontal distribution and so on. But yeah, that was interesting. Yes, Peter didn't agree with my interpretation and sort of overwrote it in places, as far as I remember. But that's always an issue.
Well, I would encourage folk who have who have questions or comments they would like to and we. This is the question which I had myself. So Mark Hall has one, which is, he says, what inspired you to focus on the early medieval stuff? Was that just because Alan said, there's a job to be done, or had you already kind of gravitated to an interest in the Dark Ages, as it must have been called then still?
It's difficult to remember exactly what the combination was, but I had always had an interest in that period, partly because I think it was so relatively little known that there are lots of possibilities there, lots of possible interpretations. So it's a very open field, whereas, you know, if you dug Roman sites, you know, they're all the same basically, and you know basically what's going on there. But with early medieval sites, it's very different. It's much more challenging, I think, to understand what's going on.
Now you've started more controversy here. We'll just ignore Dr. Jones' comment there. There's no easy answer to that. To what? I do want to pick up on the second question which Mark had, which is there a single? Well, there's really two questions. Is there a single site that you're really, kind of is the most remarkable or engaging, and indeed, is there also a single find? I have a thought about your find, but
That's difficult. They're all
your children, they're all your favorite, right?
yeah. I mean, Iona is obviously my favorite because it's the most wonderful place to work, and also extremely extremely interesting. Finds, I don't know.
I was thinking about the Loch Lashing jacket, the jerkin.
Yeah, but that wasn't. I mean, I didn't find it, and I didn't interpret it as that.
No, I thought, okay.
I mean, in terms of things I've sort of found myself, I mean, the thing that knocked me off my seat, I think, was when Fraser Hunter appeared one day and showed me this bit of glass from Oldham, and I recognised it as an Anglo-Saxon inkwell, of which there's only half a dozen or so. And that really altered our whole picture of what the site was, you know, because if you have inkwells, you have people writing, and therefore it's probably monastic, you know, which had not been thought to be before. And I don't think there were many people around who would have recognised that particular fragment of glass as being from that particular type of 8th century inkwell. So that sort of thing is really, you know, really exciting when that sort of thing happens.
I see there's a nice and maybe quite a difficult question here posed by Luca Ottinello, who's has a Sardinian connection, and he's wondering, and now the questions is, he's wondering whether there's any of the imported wares that you've come across could be linked to Sardinia at all, and the Shardana, who are sea people. Is that I mean, I've not heard of that, but
No.
you might be more. Alice.
I hear a baby.
Yeah, that's thank you, Alice.
No, nothing specifically from Sardinia. I mean, there are quite a lot of unidentified wares, particularly at Tintagel, which could come from anywhere in the Mediterranean, and they need more work done on them. So it's a possibility, but at the moment, there's nothing specific that could come from Sardinia.
Ian Ralston has posed a question here, which is, given your experience of working in Scottish archaeology, what do you think has changed the most for the better, and what has changed the most for the worse?
Oh.
I know. So these are hard questions.
Well, I mean, you know, what's changed for the worse is that it's really hard to get students anywhere, and so we can't really go digging very much anymore. So surely COVID is the worst thing. So we can put a pin in that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. It hurts my brain too much to think about this.
I think, to me, what might resonate with you, Ewan, has been the kind of decline of museum find specialists. You know, that in absolute numbers. Oh, yeah. You know,
that's one thing I would mention. Yeah.
And you've been trying to remedy that, and you bring people on, you know, insofar as you can, but you know, you're not, the tide is still going out in terms of the number of specialists we have.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether you feel that's something which is, we should, you know, is correctable or is beyond correction. I don't know.
Well, I mean, there are people coming through. but it's only the larger, very large excavation units that really can afford to have a specialised finds person. And there's a lot of smaller units which don't have anybody. So I mean that doesn't help really.
Good for you
And
though,
also,
right?
Sorry?
It's good for you though. You get to do reports.
Oh, well, yes, but I got to stop. Yeah. No, I'm not sure I can really answer the questions, but
okay, well that's all right. Some of these things maybe
of Scottish archaeology.
Yeah, maybe we can reflect on these over the course of the year. I wonder if you'd like to say a bit more about some of these site archives you worked on, and were any of these, was Atkinson, I imagine, was probably pretty organized, but maybe that's just a misunderstanding. So which ones were the easiest to do and which ones were the most challenging, would you say?
Well, I think all of them were difficult. And I mean, that led to their non-publication in a lot of cases because the excavators couldn't really get control of the material. I mean, Atkinson site at Solace had 2 previous research assistants work on it, and they failed to produce a coherent story, partly because the pottery was so abundant and complex and people didn't know how to deal with it. The best records really were Leslie Alcock's, which is interesting because, and I think it's partly also he tried to simplify the stratigraphy. Like he'd take a section through the banks, identify a number of important layers, and then just assume that everything else in the site belonged to the same context as these. So we'd call things like the greasy black layer and the red rubbly layer, and they just assumed that these were the same throughout the site, and that enabled them to get a better hold on what was going on. And also, I mean, surprisingly, because he'd been trained by Wheeler, of course, in India, and so he started off like at Dinas Powys, digging the site in squares with balks, but of course with the interior of the fort there was no stratigraphy, and so he eventually realized he had to take away the balks and create an open area excavation. It was the archaeology that made him do that, and it was one of the early open area excavations, I think, that were undertaken. But because he'd initially dug it in squares, the recording was by squares, and so it enabled me to have good distribution maps of the finds, even though there wasn't a true 3-dimensional recording like we'd use today.
I think it's interesting. I've worked with some of his stuff as well, and he was trying to do a kind of single context thing, wasn't he? Because he would record.
Yeah.
If he recognized a black greasy layer, he would try to kind of keep that tidy and keep it separate. And he was trying to do that, but the whole kind of matrix thing was happening in his head. It wasn't as he didn't explicitly do the diagram thing for stratigraphy.
Yeah.
We've got some questions that are coming in that maybe I think we might want to let some of the attendees just kind of comment for themselves. And I'm thinking in particular, if I can put her on the spot here, Nancy Edwards, Professor Nancy Edwards, Bangor University. You've put a comment there about the significance of Ewan's research in early medieval Wales. I wondered if you wanted to maybe hop on here or just type in if you prefer. But would you like to say a bit more on Ewan's work on Wales? It's something that we didn't really talk about very much, did we?
Yeah, I'm just debating how to get me on screen. Can you hear? Can everybody hear?
We can hear you.
Yeah, because I think it's slightly wobbly. I'd just like to say that I've been rereading in the course of the research I'm doing at the moment, which is writing a book about early archaeology of early medieval Wales. I have probably reread umpteen times everything that Ewan has written about early medieval Wales, and it really stands the test of time. I've read his PhD thesis, I've read various articles, but we haven't mentioned, said much either about Llangors, which, as you know, has Alan Lane and Mark Redknapp's monograph has finally come out on this, but we haven't mentioned Longbury Bank at all. And I think that this was a very important excavation, actually, in Pembrokeshire. And I mean, you were the main, the lead author in with Alan in medieval archaeology in about 1993, is it? Something like that. And
yes, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that comes through really as an extremely important contribution, because it showed us a different kind of site that, I mean, in some ways, it was like Hillfort, but it didn't actually have any defences. It was a relatively small excavation, but a series of excavations, but at the same time, a remarkable amount came to light.
Yes, yeah. And how that site was discovered is interesting as well. There was a sherd of imported pottery found in a cave site, and looking at the site and everything, I realised it must have fallen through from a sinkhole on the ridge above, and so I assumed there must have been an important site up there. So Alan and me organised this excavation, and after several days digging in the site above, we found absolutely nothing. And we were committed to this 3-week student excavation, and then suddenly one day a piece of imported glass came up, and then imported pottery and so on, but there was no sign on we did geophysics, aerial photographs, everything. There was no sign of a site whatsoever. It was only this single sherd of imported pottery in this cave underneath, which had alerted us to the fact that there might be a site there. So it was important because it's an undefended open site, which is, we've very few of them in Western Britain dating to this period, but we can date this period. But Alan will probably agree with me. We were very fraught for the first few days when nothing was turning up in this field when we were digging it.
I can remember you asking me specifically about some cross that was carved, probably a modern one, down in the cave as well, which when you were struggling to sort of identify early medieval stuff on this site, and well, is it early medieval? I said, well, I don't think it's early medieval, you know. It was more like a piece of graffiti, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, I came to the conclusion it wasn't. I think I can't remember now.
Yes, you did. Yeah, you came to the conclusion it wasn't. Yeah.
Well, that seems like a really good piece of geological input, because I imagine if you hadn't had a good understanding of, sinkholes and caves and everything, you might not have come to imagine that the artifact had kind of tumbled into the cave.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's a couple of questions we've had here. So Dave Crane is wondering about how you think your Scots-Irish thesis ties into some of the recent work on DNA, and is that something that needs to be revisited in a way?
I don't know. Adrián probably speak more about that in a way.
Okay. Well, I mean, we thought about we're not gonna ambush you, Steve and I, with these big, huge questions about the field. But one of the things that we sort of batted around was, what are the things that you see coming over the horizon? In all the specialist work that you've done, I'm sure you've got some opinions on what bit of the world of ceramics still needs more work, and what bit of brooches, insular brooches, needs more work. And but beyond those little sort of niche specialist things that you might think needs another generation of scholars to do, what are the big things that you see coming over the horizon? And yeah, DNA is one of those things that we could talk about for a long time. But see what you think about this. What I think is that the DNA study, the modern DNA cheek swabs of everybody being applied back to the early medieval period and to prehistory, even in some cases, I think that's been the biggest step backward in terms of theory, sort of, because we believe that DNA has this kind of secret code to our identity in some way. We watch all these crime shows, and DNA is what identifies you, full stop. We have this belief that DNA has some kind of answer, a definitiveness to it. But seeing, we can link this back to the archaeology. Your work on Danad and the work on insular art that you've done emphasizes how all of these people are always in contact, and things that seem to develop in one place are always rooted in that communication in between two areas. And I think DNA is much the same. We can try to put a color, red for people with this kind of genetic code and blue for people in that way, but in real life it's something in between those things. I think sort of looking at DNA is kind of oversimplified things and actually made us go back to real cultural historical ways of understanding things. I don't know, have you read any DNA studies at all that deal with the west of Scotland and Ireland? Have you seen how they deal with it yet?
No, I've kept away from them, actually, partly for the reasons you're talking about. And yeah, I think it's interesting work, but it's the wrong questions for archaeology, really. If you think about your great-grandfather, how much of what he did influences how you carry out your life today? Not much, I think. So what's the point of it all?
Yeah, that's right. So the most recent big study was a Viking DNA paper, and they one of the people that they tested was this a Viking burial at Buckwee in Orkney, and they found out that that person was, I think, 90% British, as in that far away from what they could tell is Norwegian genetic cluster, right? So 90% looks more like Britain. And so they call, all the headlines were, this Viking was actually a Pict, but this is the 10th century in Orkney, which has had people moving through it since the first people set foot on it, and so there is something about sort of narrowing it down and saying 90% British. Well, what if it was 80%? What if it's 78% British at that point? Are we probably some people would say, he's basically Pictish at that point. 75, close enough, but there's a cutoff, and it's just I don't know. I think it just needs a lot more data. But I think Ewan's point that we're asking the wrong questions of it has got to be the best take on it altogether.
I wonder
Thanks for that.
if one of the right questions is trying to get closer to the understanding of people there in the past, and this kind of idea of, do you feel like you have more empathy with people in the Dark Ages, as it were?
Sorry, my connection's gone.
Oh, you're back.
Is it back? Yeah.
Yes. So I was just wondering whether, sort of moving on from that identity and DNA issue, whether you had, given the amount of kind of time and effort you've put into working in the early Middle Ages, Greer Jarrett wanted to know whether you felt like you had more empathy or understanding of these early medieval people as a consequence, and what would that empathy consist of, or your kind of observations about it? Or is that also the wrong question?
Probably.
I don't know. Having
I
excavated
think,
having excavated a hill fort, do you have more empathy with the people who maybe live there?
I maybe have more understanding of what their life was like, but knowing actually what they were like is very difficult. I mean, I think as the paper on psychology and archaeology says, I mean, most of our interpretations tell us more about ourselves rather than the past.
What about, can I prompt you then a little bit? What about your work on Iona? Because I can give you a snippet, you know, of my take on working on Iona is that, you know, I'm a non-believer. I was raised Catholic, but have been the worst Catholic ever born since then, you know. I just don't have any religion. But when I go to Iona and it's a beautiful day and the supernatural color of the water and the geology across the way on Mull pops out, and you climb up Dunee or any of the hills and you're looking out over the monastery, you get the vibes, man. You get vibes. I don't know. What about your work on Iona?
Oh yeah, I mean, I very much, yeah, understand that connection with the landscape and think it's very important. I mean, I think Iona was chosen because of that as that centre for an important monastery, and there's other places as well. Danad itself are chosen for their place in the landscape and the physical aspects around it and so on. And yes, I do, in that sense, empathize with people in the past. I don't think they would have. I think we can all appreciate those particular, the vibe, if you like, of those particular places. They are special places, and they've always been special places. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just trying to juggle these chat questions. I think one of the questions that's popped up is a bit more perhaps less philosophical, and it's Sarah Merceru was just curious to know where the gaps are in terms of archaeology specialists in our field at the moment. You know.
You mean in archaeology in general or early medieval?
Well, I was thinking particularly of early medieval or medieval Scottish, whatever.
Yeah. All finds we need people in, you know, in terms of specialists. We need to be able to find the lower status sites. That's very important, and how that's going to be done, I'm not entirely sure, except by accident, as it sometimes happens.
Are you concerned about the pottery and glass studies? Like, who's going to take on this material?
Well, there are several people like Maria Duggan, who's going to be speaking, I think, later in the seminar series, who are got expertise in these fields. Whether people will be able to undertake specialist reports, I mean, I think that's an issue in terms of academia. But the sort of work which myself and people like Colleen Beatty do in terms of specialist reports don't count for anything in terms of ref and research profile. and yet it's the basis of most of the work for reporting on excavations and so on, and understanding the excavations. And so I think that's a real problem, that it won't be valued in academic work anymore.
Right. Well, we should probably take one more question. I want to make sure that we leave time. We'll leave a minute at the end, just so I can tell you about the rest of the events that follow on from this. We have about one event a month from here until April. But I don't know. Let's do maybe one more question, and then I can tell you about what's coming up next in the program.
One of the questions that's here is it concerns this this long history of connections between Scotland and Ireland. And I wonder, what Nikki Whitehouse is wanting to know is your view about whether this period is particularly distinctive in terms of the connections. Are we looking at a moment when there's lots of interactivity, or is it just that we're choosing to be interested in this period and so therefore we see it?
No, my feeling is that it's been pretty constant interaction. I mean, the only increase is due possibly to increase in boat technology, well, obviously particularly by the Norse period, but obviously, but I think there was constant interaction throughout prehistory. I don't think this particularly, that we're focusing on it because of the historical sources or whatever.
Okay. Well, that's kind of an interesting alternative to some of the people you were, the context in which you were originally writing in had suggested that actually that it was very episodic and there wasn't so much, and people like Richard Warner were kind of were really wanting to downplay that level of connection in the Iron Age, and making it very specific. So that's interesting. As well, first of all, can I just thank Ewan for agreeing to be the subject of our session and indeed of our series. I know it's a bit uncomfortable, and so I appreciate he's prepared to do that. And we're looking forward to the way things are going to unfold over the next several months, and we're looking forward to kind of building to a big end. So we're not quite sure what the big end is going to be, but the fact that at one point we had 124 people logged on to here suggests that there's quite an appetite for this and for this area. So that's very encouraging for us. So I'm going to shut up and let Adrián tell us about the next stage. Okay.
Right. So just to let you all know, I hope you can all see that on your screen. The next few events, again, so we have basically one event a month. So we're taking over the two lecture strands, which are weekly lecture series at the University of Glasgow. One is through the Archaeology seminar series, which is Wednesdays at 4 o'clock. And some of them are in the Celtic and Scottish Studies, the Center for Scottish and Celtic Studies. And those are Tuesdays at 5:30. So depending on which day it is, there's a different way of registering. So that's a bit of a faff. I apologize for that, but it's a good thing because we're doing it collaboratively to get as many people as possible involved. So the next session in this seminar series, 11 November at this time, okay, Wednesday at 4, that's going to be the latest on these imported ceramic wares by Maria Duggan of Newcastle University, who's in the audience, and Andy Seaman, who will be doing an update on Dinas Powys, but hill forts in Western Britain more generally. And for those of you paying attention, Dinas Powys was one of the first hill forts that Ewan got involved with. So this is really coming full circle here, but we're seeing some of the latest work on areas that Ewan has worked on in the past. Okay, I believe, and one of the Glasgow Unibods could correct me, but I believe the Zoom link that you used to log on for this one tonight will be the same Zoom link for that one, for any Wednesday at 4 o'clock. But in any case, sign up for the mailing list, Google University of Glasgow archaeology events, or follow this link. And then for the next one, 15 December, another two-hander. This is Professor Catherine Forsyth, who will be giving her latest take on the Danad Ogham inscription. Really, really important work there. And then I'll be back on, unfortunately, to tell you a little bit more about the work that Kate and I have both done, looking at the stones, and in particular, looking at the geology of those stones, the carved stones, the early Christian crosses from Iona, and tell you a little bit about how I'm taking that forward as well. That one you can register for already on Eventbrite. Just follow the Center for Scottish and Celtic Studies. In the next year, the next session in the new year, also on Zoom, again on this platform, another two-hander, Gordon Noble, University of Aberdeen, new work, new radiocarbon dates from Clatchard Craig, really important, and Kathy McKeever of AOC in partnership with Perth and Kinross Heritage Trust and the Dunkeld and Burnham History Society. New excavations on King's Seat in Dunkeld, another hill fort, where excavations and investigation is ongoing, something that Ewan is involved in as the finds expert as usual. So don't miss that one. And Kathy McKeever, again, another alumnus of the SURF project. February and March dates to be determined, so stay tuned. Follow us on our social media channels. Professor Neil Sharples, who I think is with us in the audience, will talk about wheelhouses, another thing, and the material culture of the Hebrides in general, something that Ewan has been intimately involved in throughout his career. We'll hear a little bit from Sharon Webb, who is there from the Kilmartin Trust. This is one of the biggest parts of Ewan's sort of extracurricular career, is his involvement with Kilmartin and the Kilmartin Trust. You'll hear more about what they're doing at the Kilmartin Museum, including displaying the objects from such Ewan Campbell joints as Danad. And then Professor Nancy Edwards, who we've heard from already, thank you very much once again, will be giving a lecture based on some of her upcoming work, Time and Memory in Early Medieval Wales, another thing very important when you're thinking about sort of things near and dear to Ewan's heart. Okay, and as Steve mentioned, we're going to try and wrap up. We're leaving this open-ended for now for obvious reasons. Just look around you, okay? But we're leaving the final event in April open-ended. It's 90% certain at this point it's probably going to be a Zoom thing. But we're going to try to pull a workshop together to capture, in particular, the new generation, if you like, Ewan's students. We had a lot of people who really wanted to be involved in this seminar series, but we only have so many slots. That's why we've doubled them up in almost every one of these dates. We're having 2 presentations per, because we had so many people who wanted to get involved. And we have a lot of Ewan's students and colleagues, current colleagues, that wanted to speak as well. I think the April workshop is probably the best way to capture some of that new research that is based on work that Ewan has had a hand in. Okay, and I think that's helping us build towards whatever form this festschrift might take. So that's what's coming up. Obviously, I'll hand over to Steve for the farewell. There is more to come in the University of Glasgow Archaeology Seminar Series.
Thank you for making Ewan's day, making our day. It's great to see so many people. And, anyway.
Yes, thank you all again very, very much. I'm just, as you noticed, a bit overwhelmed.
Okay, well, we'll see you all again somewhere soon, I hope. Thanks very much for tuning in.
Man, if ever there was a lecture that needed to end in a pint at the pub, it would be this one, man. But we're going to have to save that for April, I suppose.